Jean-Claude Van Damme. He fought poverty with discipline. He fought Hollywood with raw charisma. But his greatest fight was the one no one saw the fight to stay alive when the lights went out. From glory to addiction, from collapse to quiet redemption. This is how a man loses everything and chooses to rise again. But before the fame, before the fights, there was a fragile boy in Brussels, and his war began the first time he looked into the mirror. Before the muscles, before the fame, before Hollywood, there was just a boy, small, thin, and nearly invisible. In a gray apartment block in Brussels, Jean-Claude Van Varenberg stood before a bathroom mirror with a tiny crack running down the corner. He was 9 years old, wearing hand-me-down clothes that didn't fit and glasses that seemed heavier than his hopes. Outside, the city buzzed with trams and strangers. But inside, in that little tiled room, the world was silent. He didn't like what he saw. The boy in the reflection looked like a mistake. His arms were too thin to be strong, his posture too unsure to be proud. School had been another day of being ignored, or worse, noticed. A kick in the hallway, a smirk from the popular kids, a whisper in the lunchroom that turned into cruel laughter. And when he came home, no one asked how he was. His father, a florist and former military man, ruled with silence and frown. His mother was kind, but tired. Always tired. Jean-Claude ate alone. He went to sleep without a goodnight kiss. No bedtime stories. No warmth. Just the chill of loneliness seeping into his bones. But in that mirror, night after night, he stared harder, hoping something inside him might shift. Hoping the boy on the other side might one day become someone worth fighting for. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. Instead, he started to move. Karate became his salvation. He begged to take classes. At first, it was just to look strong. But something deeper awakened a rhythm, a discipline, a place where pain had purpose. And then came ballet, a secret he kept from the boys at school. They would never understand the control it gave him, the quiet power of grace. In the dojo and the dance studio, he wasn't the four-eyed loser. He was balance, precision of fire. But that mirror still haunted him, because every night after the sweat and the strain, he came back to it, hoping for transformation, fearing he'd always see the same fragile child. Sometimes he clenched his fists until his knuckles went white. Other nights, he just stood there still as stone asking a question. And he never said out loud, "Will I ever be enough?" Not yet. But something inside him refused to break. Each punch, each pirouette, each bruise was not just training. It was rebellion, not against the world, against the reflection. He didn't want applause. He wanted proof that he could rewrite his own shape, that he could matter. And though the mirror never changed, he did. That was the beginning, not of a movie star, not of a martial artist, but of a soul in survival mode fighting not for glory, but for the right to exist. There was a little church near his neighborhood in Brussels, old, crumbling, forgotten by most. It stood between two narrow alleys like a secret the city had tried to bury its stone walls darkened by rain, its wooden doors almost always ajar. Inside, there were no priests, no candles constantly lit, no choirs rehearsing psalms, just dust dancing in sunbeams, worn-out pews, and the heavy scent of time. And it was there, into that decaying silence, that 12-year-old Jean-Claude Van Varenberg found something sacred. Not religion, not doctrine, but stillness. He would enter quietly sometimes after school, sometimes after a day of being ridiculed or ignored, and sit in the very back where the shadows felt safe. With his legs dangling and his backpack beside him, he would look up at the stained glass. those broken mosaics of saints and swords, beasts and angels, and imagine a world far from Brussels. A world where he was strong. A world where people listened when he spoke. A world where he mattered. One day, when the last light of afternoon turned the pews gold and the air smelled like old wood and rain, he whispered 3 wishes to the empty church. Save the world. Protect nature. Become a movie star. He said them softly, reverently, like offerings to something he didn't fully understand. They were the wishes of a boy raised on comic books and daydreams, someone who believed that strength meant service, that fame could be kindness, that success could mean saving something, anything. He didn't yet know how cruel dreams could be, that the spotlight is not warm but burning, that fame feeds on innocence, that to become what the world applauds you often lose what your soul truly needs. But in that moment, he believed in himself, in the quiet, in something bigger. Maybe he didn't have friends. Maybe his teachers never praised him. Maybe his father never hugged him. But here in this forgotten church, beneath the faded gaze of saints who never blinked, he felt seen. He imagined himself as a cinematic hero diving through flames, kicking down evil, carrying wounded animals out of a collapsing forest. He imagined the crowd cheering. He imagined being the one who could not be ignored. But beneath those glowing fantasies, another feeling stirred hunger. Not for food, but for witness. For someone to look at him and say, "I see you. You're not invisible anymore." And that hunger, innocent as it seemed, would one day consume everything in its path. The world would hear his name, but the cost would be enormous. What he didn't know then, sitting alone in that sanctuary of dreams, was that the very wish that gave him hope, the wish to become a star, would become the flame that scorched the other 2. One day, he would forget the forest. One day, he would forget the world. The year America didn't care who he was. The year Jean-Claude Van Varenberg, with nothing but a dream and a duffel bag, landed in Los Angeles and disappeared into the blur of forgotten faces. He spoke little English. He had no connections, no money, no plan B, only that same quiet fire from the church pews in Brussels, now flickering against the cold metal of a rusted car door. That car, a battered old Toyota Celica, became his bedroom, his shelter, his prison. Parked on the edge of faded streets in East Hollywood, it smelled of stale fast food wrappers, sweat, and desperation. He curled his spine to fit the back seat, using his gym bag as a pillow and his jean jacket as a blanket. At night, he stared through the foggy windshield, watching the city that promised dreams hand out indifference instead. The pavement was hot in the day, but the nights bit through his skin like frost. He was always hungry, the kind of hunger that gnaws at your dignity before it takes your strength. He once stole bread from a convenience store, just a small loaf. No butter, no shame. The clerk yelled. He didn't run. He bowed and walked away. That was his apology. That was his pride. Rejection came daily, not in loud slams, but in quiet, sterile smiles. "Sorry, not the look we're going for." "Interesting accent. We'll call you." They never did. Over 100 auditions, casting calls, martial arts studios, all slammed shut. He was too foreign, too stiff, too weird, too hopeful. One man told him to change his name. Another told him to change his face. But every morning, no matter how empty his stomach or how bruised his spirit, Jean-Claude woke before the sun. He jogged. He stretched. He kicked the air like it was mocking him. And when he finished, sweat dripping from his jaw, breath-ragged eyes burning, he'd whisper one line to the rising light. "Thank you for the success that's already mine." It wasn't delusion. It was survival. He believed in something no one else could see. Not talent, but timing. Not luck, but inevitability. He believed that one day the world would be forced to look his way. He believed the mirror would finally nod back. Faith is not always religious. Sometimes it lives in broken cars and aching bones and empty pockets. Sometimes it's the only thing that keeps you from fading. That year, America did not give him a home, but it gave him something else, the edge of desperation. And on that edge, Jean-Claude sharpened his soul until it could cut through anything, even fate. It wasn't just a film. Bloodsport was a birth, a violent, sacred, cinematic birth of a soul that had been scraping against obscurity for far too long. On set, under the harsh lights and the foreign heat of Hong Kong, Jean-Claude Van Damme didn't simply perform, he bled. He bled memory. He bled pain. He bled every rejection that had ever told him he wasn't enough. The punches weren't choreography, they were testimony. The sweat wasn't theatrical, it was penance. The camera didn't just capture a fight, it captured an exorcism. Because inside that ring, in those silent, slow-motion screams, in those impossible splits that tore the sky open, the world wasn't just witnessing action, it was witnessing resurrection. And for the first time in his life, Jean-Claude was no longer trying to be someone he was. Frank Dux was based on a myth, but what Jean-Claude brought to it wasn't myth, it was memory. The memory of sleeping in a car while the city laughed. The memory of hunger that turned into hallucination. The memory of kicking alone in alleyways with no audience, whispering, "Thank you," to a future that hadn't come. All of it poured into the screen. Every scene was a scar. Every sequence a scream from the boy in Brussels who had once stood before a mirror begging for transformation. And now here it was, not as a miracle, but as a miracle he had earned. When the film wrapped and the world finally took notice, Jean-Claude didn't celebrate. He wept. Not because he had made it, but because for the first time, he felt real, tangible. Not the invisible boy, not the foreign extra, not the punchline, but a man who had turned rejection into rhythm, a man who had fought with ghosts and walked out breathing. The tears weren't for fame, they were for the mirror. Because after all these years, it had finally reflected something else. Not weakness, not shame, not longing, but existence, a self reborn. But even in that moment of triumph, something trembled beneath the surface. Because when a man builds his identity on pain, success doesn't heal, it threatens. If he's no longer fighting to be seen, who is he now? If the world claps instead of turning away, what replaces the fire? The applause was loud, but it couldn't drown out the whisper inside him that said, "Don't stop, or you'll disappear again." And so Bloodsport became more than a breakout film. It became the beginning of another war, not against rejection, but against emptiness, against the terrifying realization that even when the world finally sees you, it may never truly know you, and that sometimes the most painful thing isn't to be invisible, it's to be legendary and still feel like a shadow inside your own skin. He got everything he ever wanted, and it broke him. After Bloodsport, the world opened its arms and Hollywood crowned him not just as a star, but as something more intoxicating. A god, Kickboxer Lionheart, Universal Soldier. Time Cop, each film made him bigger, faster, stronger in the eyes of millions. He wasn't just in movies, he was the movie, a blur of muscle fury and impossible elegance. Audiences didn't just watch Jean-Claude Van Damme, they worshipped him. He became the man every boy wanted to be, The fighter every villain feared, the sex symbol every magazine devoured. On screen, he could leap, strike, split, and smile like gravity didn't apply to him. He was no longer the boy in the mirror. He was the reflection the world wanted. But no one ever tells gods they're allowed to rest. No one asks them how they sleep. No one sees them when the crowd disappears and the lights go out. They only expect more. More power. More films. More perfection. Jean-Claude was filming non-stop, promoting posing. Flying, lifting, training, always performing. He became a machine not because he wanted to, but because it was the only way to survive the pedestal he'd been placed on. And slowly, quietly, the cost began to show. He stopped calling home. He stopped sleeping well. He missed birthdays, missed silence, missed himself. He was adored by millions, yet he couldn't hold his family together. His first marriage cracked under the weight of his schedule. Then another. Then another. He tried to be a father, a husband, a man. But the myth always won. It always came first. The world had given him glory, but taken away peace. And when he stood alone in luxury hotel rooms with marble floors and champagne on ice, all he saw were shadows. He had become what he had dreamed, a global legend. And yet inside, he was emptier than ever. Because the applause was addictive, the success was hollow, and the truth he never dared say aloud was this: he didn't know who he was when he wasn't fighting. Jean-Claude was now a symbol, but Jean-Claude the man was disappearing. His face was on posters in every continent, but he couldn't remember the last time someone looked at him and saw him. Not the icon, not the brand, just the tired, broken boy beneath it all. And so he smiled harder in interviews, pushed through injuries, hid the fatigue behind sunglasses, gave the fans what they wanted, because he was living the dream right. He had no right to feel lost, but he was. And somewhere deep inside, he knew the higher you fly, the lonelier the air becomes. He wasn't just playing gods on screen. He had become one. And gods are worshipped, but never truly loved. 5 women tried to love him. 5 women walked into his life with open hands and soft hope, believing that behind the fighter, the sex symbol, the star there, was still a man, and that man could be held. But loving Jean-Claude Van Damme was like trying to hold lightning. It dazzled. It danced. And then, it burned. He married 5 times, and each time he meant it. In the moment, under vows and tuxedos and applause, he believed love could save him. That maybe a woman's touch could quiet the chaos. That maybe coming home to arms that didn't demand, didn't direct, didn't expect, just held, could soften the edges he had sharpened for war. But the battlefield was never out there. It was inside him. And no one had trained him how to fight when the enemy wasn't another man, but his own restlessness. His first marriage crumbled under the pressure of absence. He was filming Flying Gone more than present. The second tried to anchor him with understanding, but she couldn't compete with a world that cheered louder than she could speak. The third caught him at the height of his godhood: red carpets, limousines, international headlines, and watched him slowly forget how to listen. The fourth found him already cracked. She loved the broken pieces, thinking her love would be the glue. It wasn't. And then there was Gladys, the woman who saw through the noise, the woman who bore his children, who knew the boy behind the legend, who witnessed both the ascent and the fall. She left, and later, she returned. But only after both had bled enough to understand that love isn't about fixing someone, it's about choosing them again and again, even after they've shattered you. Each woman came with hope, each left with scars, not from fists, but from distance, from waking up next to someone whose body was there, But spirit was always elsewhere on set, in mirrors, in childhood wounds, still festering under celebrity skin. He didn't cheat because he didn't care. He didn't leave because he didn't love. He self-sabotaged because part of him still believed he wasn't worthy. That no matter how much love he received, it was always temporary, conditional. That eventually everyone would see through the muscles, the charm, the myth, and walk away. So he walked first, or he destroyed it first, or he numbed it before it could bloom. The tragedy of Jean-Claude Van Damme's love life wasn't that he couldn't find love. It was that he didn't know how to hold it, how to rest in it without feeling exposed. The stage gave him adoration. The camera gave him control. But love, real, raw, quiet love, demanded vulnerability. There are some fights you can't win with fists. Some battles that break you without leaving a single bruise. For Jean-Claude Van Damme, the hardest hit of his life came not in a ring, not on a film set, not from any enemy he could see, but in a courtroom when a judge took away what no one else ever had, and his son. The cameras didn't catch it. The headlines didn't shout it. But for Jean-Claude, that moment shattered something deeper than bones. It wasn't just the loss of custody, it was the unbearable silence that followed. The empty chair at the dinner table. The phone that didn't ring. The questions he couldn't answer, even to himself. How did I let it come to this? He had fought so hard to become a legend, to be remembered, to rise above poverty, rejection, and self-doubt. And yet, when it mattered most, when the battle was about love, about presence, about fatherhood, he wasn't there. Maybe he was filming. Maybe he was numbing the pain with fame, or with pills, or with noise. Maybe he was still that lost boy in the church, whispering to stained glass instead of holding his own child. And so the world kept clapping, and he kept performing. But inside, something had collapsed. Jean-Claude didn't scream. He didn't punch walls. He didn't spiral into rage. He simply dimmed. The light in his eyes softened. The energy in his body slowed. He gave interviews. He smiled. But behind it all was a man walking through a life that no longer felt like his. Not seeing my son, he once admitted, destroyed me. It was the kind of hurt that fame couldn't erase and fortune couldn't distract from. It followed him through red carpets. It crept into his hotel rooms. It stared at him through mirrors far crueler than the one in Brussels. Because this time, he wasn't fighting for a role. He was fighting to be a father. And he had lost. Not to a person, but to his own past. To his choices. To the whirlwind, he had become a man in motion, too fast to hold on to anything, even what mattered most. And yet the pain didn't make him bitter. It made him quiet. It made him reflective. It made him listen. For the first time in years, Jean-Claude didn't try to be seen. He tried to see. The boy he couldn't protect. The man he had become. The gap between them wide, haunting, echoing with what-ifs. He had known failure before, but this was different. This wasn't about image. This was about love. There comes a point when a man stops fighting the world and starts fighting himself. And for Jean-Claude Van Damme, that war began in silence. At first it was just a line, a whisper of powder, a little something to take the edge off the loneliness, the exhaustion, the ache of constantly being. Someone for everyone. But cocaine doesn't ask for permission, it just moves in. And soon, it wasn't one line, it was 5, 10, then 10 grams a day. His blood ran fast, his thoughts faster, his soul nowhere to be found. The man who had trained his body into sculpture, who had taught muscles to defy gravity, was now a prisoner inside the same flesh. His body, once titanium, now shook under the weight of dependency. His eyes, once fierce and focused, now darted with paranoia. The mirror that once haunted him now mocked him, because the boy who hated his reflection was back. Only this time he was older, thinner, colder, and he knew better. But that's the thing about addiction, it doesn't care what you know. It only cares that you forget. And Jean-Claude forgot everything: the discipline, the vows, the children, the promises made in churches and dressing rooms and lonely hotel beds. He forgot the hunger that made him train in parking lots, forgot the prayers whispered to the morning sky, forgot the boy who once stole bread to survive, because now he was stealing pieces of his own life just to feel alive. The roles started drying up. The studios whispered. The tabloids sharpened their knives. The very machine that once built him now began to turn away, because Hollywood loves a comeback, but it hates a mess. And Jean-Claude was no longer a myth. He was a warning. Friends disappeared. Lovers turned cold. His body stopped listening. The splits hurt more. The kicks came slower. Even gravity seemed to resent him. But he didn't cry for help, because pride doesn't scream, it withers. He isolated, hid, numbed. He was still famous, still visible, but he had never felt more invisible. The man who once inspired awe was now inspiring pity, and to someone who had built his worth on strength that was a deeper shame than failure. He tried to lie to himself, said it was under control, said he could quit, said he was just tired. But deep down, he knew he wasn't the one winning anymore. He was just another warrior bleeding in an arena no one watched. No scripts, no choreography, no crowd. Just a man locked in a cage of his own making, swinging at shadows. Because sometimes the enemy isn't out there. It's in your bloodstream, in your silence, in the echo of all the things you were supposed to be and no longer are. Hong Kong. A luxury hotel room high above the city, filled with the hum of air conditioning and the faint scent of spilled whiskey. Outside, neon lights painted the night in colors that didn't belong to nature. Pinks, blues, reds, like the whole city was trying to distract him from what he was about to do. Inside, Jean-Claude Van Damme sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing. Not the skyline, not the mirror. Just the void between heartbeat and silence. For years, he had been performing even when no one was watching, always rehearsing the same illusion that he was fine, that the legend was still intact, that he still mattered. But now, under the heavy weight of his own stillness, the truth came crawling back, raw, merciless, and simple. He was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep cures, but the kind that seeps into your bones, into your memories, into the parts of you that once believed. The applause had faded. The cameras had moved on. The crowds that once screamed his name were now chasing newer gods. He had fought addiction fame loss himself. And for what? The money didn't fill the hole. The women couldn't mend it. The trophies had no warmth. The body that once made him immortal now trembled from exhaustion. The mind that once imagined miracles now whispered one quiet command: enough. He thought about his son, his mother, the boy who once sat in a church whispering dreams into the rafters. He thought about how far that boy had come and how far he had fallen. And then he thought about the simplest truth of all: maybe the world didn't need him anymore. Maybe the fight was over. The hotel lights flickered. Somewhere down the hall, someone laughed, a reminder that life was still happening, just not his. He poured another drink, stared at it, then at the window. The city below looked peaceful, almost beautiful. But beauty means nothing when your soul can't feel it. He reached for the edge of the table, not for the glass, but for the idea of ending the noise. He could end it now, quietly. No cameras, no witnesses, no pain. Just silence, the kind he had been chasing his entire life. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the memory of his mother's voice. Maybe it was the image of his son's face. Or maybe it was something smaller, the simple instinct of a fighter who refuses to surrender, even when there's no one left to fight. He put the glass down. He sat there for hours, breathing, shaking, crying without sound. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't a victory. It was survival, pure, stripped animal survival. When morning came, the city outside didn't care that a man had decided to keep living. For years, Jean-Claude Van Damme thought he was cursed. He thought he was weak, reckless, unstable, doomed to destroy everything he touched. The highs were too high. The sleepless nights that turned into manic mornings, where he felt invincible, where his mind raced faster than his body could keep up. The lows were too low days when even breathing felt like failure, when light hurt his eyes, when the mirror wasn't just cruel but unbearable. He would wake up shaking, drenched in sweat, unsure whether the last 24 hours had been a dream or a breakdown. He blamed himself. The world blamed him too. They called it ego. They called it excess. But no one, not even him, understood that what was happening inside wasn't arrogance, it was illness. Then came the diagnosis bipolar disorder. 2 words that didn't destroy him, but finally explained him. It was the first time anyone had given a name to the chaos that ruled his life. The first time someone told him that he wasn't just broken, he was suffering. The relief was so deep, it hurt. For the first time, the monster had a face. For the first time, he could look at it without shame. The doctors told him what he had always known, but never dared to say that his brilliance and his torment came from the same fire. That the same energy that made him perform 20 hours straight without rest was the same energy that later drowned him in despair. His entire life had been a pendulum swinging violently between ecstasy and emptiness, and now he finally saw the mechanism behind the motion. He wasn't insane. He wasn't cursed. He was human. And that realization didn't fix everything, but it gave him something he hadn't had in years: permission. Permission to stop pretending. Permission to heal. Permission to forgive himself. Jean-Claude began treatment, therapy, meditation, medication. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't cinematic. It was slow, exhausting, humiliating at times. There were relapses. Days he hated the pills. Days he missed the manic rush that made him feel like God. But there was progress too. He began sleeping again, eating again, feeling again. He learned to listen to his body, to his thoughts, to the rhythms he had ignored for decades. He began to understand that being strong didn't mean being invincible. It meant staying even when it hurt. He started reading about other artists who had the same diagnosis. He saw himself in them, brilliant wounded souls trying to balance creation with destruction. When everything else failed, the fame, the money, the love, the chaos, Jean-Claude returned too. The only thing that had ever made sense: discipline. The same quiet, sacred rhythm that had once shaped a fragile boy in Brussels now became the lifeline of a man trying to rebuild his soul. He didn't go back to the dojo for nostalgia. He went because it was the only place where his mind stopped screaming. The floor was cold, the air still, and the sound of his bare feet striking the mat reminded him that he was still here. He bowed as he had done as a child, not to anyone else, but to the fight itself, the eternal duel between order and destruction. Karate was no longer about perfection. It was about presence. Each movement was prayer. Each breath a confession. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if retracing his entire life through muscle memory. The kick that carried him out of poverty, the punch that defied the bullies, the balance that kept him from falling apart when the world did. Ballet returned too quietly without applause. He practiced alone in silence in a small studio with cracked mirrors and dust-covered floors. The same art that had once made him an outcast now became his redemption. The grace he had been mocked for as a boy was now the grace that kept him alive as a man. Each plie was forgiveness, each turn a letting go. There was no audience, no camera, no validation, just the rhythm of his own breathing, the sound of muscles rediscovering honesty. He trained not to perform, but to endure. The discipline that once built a career now rebuilt a man. It stripped him of ego, of illusion, of noise. It took him back to simplicity, the clean, brutal truth of repetition. There is something sacred about doing the same thing every day until it changes you, and Jean-Claude understood that now. The world had taught him to chase everything. Discipline taught him to stay still. He began meditating daily, waking before sunrise, eating clean, speaking less. He became obsessed with balance, not just in body, but in spirit. He spoke to his students not as a star, but as a survivor. When you lose control, he told them, you lose yourself. But when you train, you build a bridge between your body and your mind. That bridge can carry you out of darkness. He smiled when he said it, not the Hollywood smile that once sold millions, but a humble human one. The kind that comes from knowing pain and choosing peace anyway. He trained every day, not for vanity, not for legacy, but for gratitude. A small Belgian film crew gathers in a modest post office turned movie set. There are no explosions, no special effects, no million-dollar contracts, just a man older. And now his face lined by time and guilt standing under flickering fluorescent light. The movie is called JCVD. For the world, it was an indie curiosity. For Jean-Claude Van Damme, it was Judgment Day. For decades, he had played heroes, indestructible men who saved others and never bled for real. But now, stripped of makeup, stripped of myth, he would bleed without a fight scene. The script called for a 6-minute monologue. No action, no music. Just him, alone, speaking to the camera, confessing. When the director called action, something broke open inside him, something raw and ancient, something that had waited years in silence. He started speaking the lines, but soon they weren't lines anymore. They were truth. His voice trembled. His eyes filled. The crew froze. He spoke about the fame, the failure, the addictions, the betrayals. Not like an actor remembering a character's pain, but like a sinner standing before God. "I'm just a man," he said. "I've done bad things. I've hurt people. I've hurt myself. I've been lost." Every sentence came from somewhere deeper than memory, from a place language usually cannot reach. His tears fell freely, unplanned, unperformed. And in that moment, the camera stopped being a machine. It became a mirror, and for the first time in his life, he didn't look away. There was no audience to impress, no stunt to perfect, no persona to hide behind. Just Jean-Claude, the boy from Brussels, who wanted to be seen, finally allowing himself to be seen. The world watched that scene in silence. Critics who once mocked him wept. Fans who once worshipped his strength now saw his fragility and loved him more for it. Because in those 6 minutes, he did what no explosion ever could. He made people feel. JCVD wasn't just a film. It was a confession. It was redemption without glory, forgiveness without religion. It was an aging man saying, "I am not who you think I am," and that's okay. The applause that followed was different this time, softer, kinder. It wasn't for the legend. It was for the human being who had the courage to come back from himself. When the cameras stopped, Jean-Claude didn't celebrate. He just sat there breathing tears drying on his cheeks, a quiet peace settling in. He didn't need to win anymore. He didn't need to prove anything. For the first time since childhood, he felt light, not the artificial light of fame, but the kind that comes after confession when you've finally emptied the darkness. She had every reason not to come back. She had seen it all, the rising fame, the falling promises, the broken nights filled with silence, lies, and absences that screamed louder than words. Gladys Portugues had once loved Jean-Claude Van Damme with the fierce heart of a woman who believed in the boy behind the legend. But love, no matter how deep, cannot survive in a house of mirrors. And so she left, not out of anger, but out of survival. Years passed. Wounds deepened. Regret aged with him. And then, somewhere between the ashes of addiction and the quiet confessions of an older man, Jean-Claude found himself thinking about her not just as someone he had lost, but as someone he had failed. He didn't chase her with grand gestures. He didn't promise her a changed man. He simply began to change, not to win her back, but because it was time. Because he was tired of being a storm that destroyed everything good that tried to hold him. He began calling again, listening, showing up, not as a star, not as the muscles from Brussels, just as Jean-Claude, a man who had hurt someone and was finally ready to say I'm sorry. And she came back, not because he was famous, not because she had forgotten, but because forgiveness, real forgiveness, is not forgetting. It's remembering everything and still choosing love. They didn't rebuild in fireworks. They rebuilt in the quiet, side by side, day by day, through patience, through therapy, through awkward conversations and uncomfortable truths. They laughed more, cried sometimes, held hands when no one was watching. He cooked. She asked about his training. They spoke about the past without drowning in it. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was better. It was real. And that made it sacred. Love had returned to Jean-Claude's life not with fireworks, but with humility. And this time, he didn't try to own it. He honored it, not with diamonds, but with discipline. Not with promises, but with presence. He had learned that redemption doesn't come from a second chance. It comes from deserving one. And now, every morning he wakes up beside Gladys. It is not with the fire of a young man chasing passion, but with the peace of an older one, grateful to be chosen again. That, for him, is the final redemption, not the love he found, but the love that found him when he finally became someone worth coming back to. He no longer chased the noise. The interviews slowed. The cameras called less. The world, once addicted to his every move, had moved on to younger gods. But Jean-Claude Van Damme didn't fight it. He welcomed it. Because somewhere along the brutal arc of fame, failure, and forgiveness, he had discovered something far more precious than spotlight silence. At 60, he rose before the sun not for vanity, but for reverence. He trained every morning not for roles, but for rhythm. His kicks were slower now, but more meaningful. Each movement a meditation. Each breath a reminder that he was still here, not as an icon, but as a man. He ate clean, practiced fasting, took long walks without headphones, letting the wind speak truths no interviewer ever asked. He kept his circle small, read philosophy, watched birds, cried sometimes without shame when a memory passed through like weather. He wasn't lonely. He was still. The silence that had once haunted him. The same silence that filled his childhood home, that echoed in hotel rooms after sold-out premieres, that screamed in his ears the night he almost gave up, was now his sanctuary. It no longer asked questions. It gave answers. And in that quiet, he began to hear things he had once drowned out: the sound of his son's laughter over the phone, the soft exhale of Gladys as she slept beside him, the creak of his knees reminding him he had survived the whisper of the boy he used to be saying, "Thank you for not leaving me behind." He no longer needed applause to feel alive. He no longer measured his worth by magazine covers or box office numbers. He had nothing to prove and everything to feel. In his home, there were no trophies on the walls, just drawings from his children, letters he wrote to himself, quiet tokens of a life finally owned, not performed. He had become, in essence, a warrior of silence, someone who had spent a lifetime fighting the world, only to realize the real victory was learning to stop, to sit, to listen, to breathe. And when people now asked him what success meant, he smiled and answered gently, "Peace." Because strength, he had learned, is not how loud you roar, but how still you can be in the face of everything you once ran from. And in that stillness, Jean-Claude Van Damme, the myth, the fighter, the fallen icon, became something far more powerful, a man at peace with the echo of his own soul. He never built an empire, never won an Oscar, never played Hamlet. But Jean-Claude Van Damme built something far more enduring, a legacy that breathes, not in statues or speeches, but in the hearts of those who saw in him the possibility of rising from nothing and making it matter. He came from silence, from the margins, from ridicule and self-loathing, and cheap shoes on the cold sidewalks of Brussels. He became famous, yes, but more than that, he became human in front of the world. He failed publicly. He broke publicly. And then slowly, painfully, courageously, he rebuilt. Piece by fragile piece. That's his legacy. Not the perfect spin kick, not the bloodied slow-motion stairs, but the man who fell and got up, fell again and got up slower, fell harder and still got up. The man who was once worshipped for his body, but will be remembered for his soul. He didn't leave behind a billion-dollar franchise. He left behind something more dangerous, more beautiful: hope. For the kid who hates his reflection. For the addict who thinks the next line will silence the pain. For the father who lost his way. For the man in a hotel room at 3 a.m. thinking it's too late. Jean-Claude Van Damme's life says otherwise. It says you can come back, even if the world forgets you, even if you forget yourself. He teaches us that strength is not the absence of pain. It's the choice to live with it, to walk through it, to listen to it. That discipline is not about control, but about devotion. That love, real love, begins when the myth dies. And perhaps most of all, that silence, the thing he feared his whole life, was never the enemy. It was the invitation to hear the voice within, to forgive the boy in the mirror, to bow not to the audience, not to the legend, but to life itself. His muscles may one day weaken, the films may fade, but the man who stood up from the edge, who chose peace over pride, who cried without shame and fought without violence, that man will breathe in the stories we tell long after the credits roll. That man will remain. If this story moved something inside you, even just a little, consider staying with us. Hit the like button if you believe in second chances. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that it's never too late. And if you haven't already, subscribe to USA Legends Never Fade. Because some stories don't just entertain us, they remind us how to survive.